Thanks for joining us on 9 News Plus. I'm Chris Bianchi. Huge protests rocked China this month, with thousands taking to the streets to express a very rare and widespread degree of anger with the government for strict COVID lockdowns. In response to those protests, the Chinese government relaxed some of its harshest COVID protocols. I spoke with Suisheng Zhao, the director of the Center for China-U.S. Cooperation at the University of Denver's Joseph Corbell School of International Studies on December the 6th for more about these remarkable protests and what they mean now and going forward.
Professor Zhao from the Corbell School at the University of Denver, thanks so much for taking the time to join us. I guess, obviously, we're going to discuss many things with you, but one of the top-line takeaways, I suppose, worldwide over the last week from China, COVID-related protests encapsulating the country. What's the latest on this, and what is prompting these somewhat surprising nationwide protests here, Professor?
Because the people are frustrated over the so-called zero COVID policy, which has locked down the cities and interrupt people's lives and make a lot of people suffering in the process. In fact, the consequences of this type of knockdowns have been much more serious than the COVID itself. The whole event in last week was triggered, I think, by two developments. One was there is a fire in Xinjiang, which had about a dozen people died because of the lockdown, because all the entrance were blocked, and the fire people could not even get into there. So these people died for nothing. People were angry at that. The second triggered event, I think, was the World Cup. People were told how serious the COVID was, and China's lockdown was necessary and successful. But people suddenly discovered the world has not done what China did. In the World Cup, thousands, hundreds of thousands people gathered, even without mask. So they find the contrast between China and the world. So people became even more angry and frustrated. They asked for freedom. They asked for the opened up to ease the lockdown. That's how those widespread protests coming up in China in last week.
So two things: fire in the deadly fire, as well, and the World Cup. Those are the two main drivers. Professor, how rare is it to see such public displays of opposition in China?
There are unrest, all this type of protests occasionally and spread it, fragmented in China in the last 20, 30 years. But this is the largest, the most widespread since the Tiananmen Square in 1989. But still, I want to put this on in context. China has about 1.4 billion population. So the scale of these protests themselves are very impressive, surprising and big, but the scale is not big enough in the context of China to produce some type of consequence to threaten the authoritarian one-party rule in China. And the Chinese government has responded to these protests. Of course, they will not admit they have made mistakes. They still insist that they will continue the so-called zero COVID policy. But in the meantime, they made required adjustments in response to those protests. So those protests are rare, and the leadership understand that this is something they have to make response, although they will not admit mistakes.
So if you're saying that what we're seeing, even though these are widespread protests, there's only a small segment of the population that's we're seeing, because China is such a large country with 1.4 billion people. How popular is or is not the communist government amongst the people? What's your assessment of that?
I think overall, the Communist Party one-party rule is still sustainable in China. I will not widely support it. But what is the alternative for the Chinese people? That's not clear. And the Communist Party in the last 70 years have come up and downs and made a lot of changes and reforms in the last 40 years. Xi Jinping has re-centralized power, in fact, reversed a lot of policy of reform. But for the Chinese people, their daily lives have not seen much changes. And in fact, I would argue that in the last 30, 40 years, China has done really well economically. And the living standard of the Chinese people has been increased. So from that perspective, there are some distractions, but the overall legitimacy of the Communist Party has been sustained by so-called economic performance legitimacy. In the meantime, they have also played the card of nationalism, try to describe how alternatives are even worse and how the world is dangerous. Western powers try to undermine the China's rise. So in that context, the Chinese people have really not seen alternative. There are problems, but they hope the government could improve, make changes themselves instead of to overthrow the Communist Party or the one-party rule. And plus, the government has been very, very ruthless to suppress any type of oppositions. The surveillance state, what people have described China is a very, very severe for people to understand what are the consequences if they try to overthrow the government. So in that case, they accept the current government if in the context, if they continue their policy, but this zero COVID policy has really ripped up a lot of people's lives. That's what we see this type of protests in China.
So how strict are these? You mentioned the zero COVID policy. What does that mean for the average person? What can they not do compared to, say, people here in the United States?
Oh, there are so many restrictions. They are locked down in their home for weeks, if not months.
Wow.
And they don't have any supplies for their goods. And they have to have a COVID test every day, sometimes twice a day. And they could not travel to anywhere. Even if they got sick, they cannot go to hospitals without the negative results of tests. So the sufferings of people, I think we cannot imagine from the West, from the United States. It's horrible. I heard so many negative stories. Not only those people who had medical problems suffer or die in the process, a lot of people get into depressed. They just jump out of their building. It's so serious, so horrible. I think it's a horrible situation. That's why people came out to the streets.
So considering that, it does seem to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the majority of people, the government, the media, average people in China seem surprised by the depth of these protests. And considering how restrictive these lockdown measures are, why are people so surprised by the amount of outcry that's come from the amount of protest that's happened?
I don't know if people are surprised in the West here. Just people have not seen those type of protests in China for quite a while. And also, I think maybe another thing I want to point out is that there are some misperceptions in the West. People thought this kind of protests is going to overthrow the communist regime, and also people are demanding for democracy. Perhaps some people among those crowds are demanding for democracy and also for through getting rid of this Communist Party regime, but that's not the majority's demand. People here, Chinese people, I think at this stage, as I said, they don't see alternatives, and there is no organized opposition in China that could gain support among the Chinese people. So their protest is just against those specific policies. So from that perspective, I don't know how much we in the West should expect that will bring fundamental change in China. So from that perspective, you ask for the surprise. It's surprise because there are not many protests in the past, but should not have a misperceptions. Say, oh, because of surprise, the Communist Party will be over. That will not be the case, at least for now. Xi Jinping has been so ruthless and powerful today. We just saw the end of the conclusion of the 20th Party Congress. He took the third term, which has not happened in last several decades, and also he put all his lawyers into the top leadership position. There is no other factions or any people could challenge his role. So in that case, I don't see any possibility people can topple his role, and the communist regime will be changed. So from that perspective, people are surprised, but should not be surprised, will not have a surprise that the regime change will take place in China.
So this is essentially what you're saying is don't read into it too much. This is a pretty strict protest against the zero COVID policies of the government.
At this time, majority of people, I think those are in their mind. If in fact the Communist Party regime has making some adjustments, and when they try to open up, I think a lot of people in China were scared. They said, if the government will not take care of us, and if we don't take a test every day, how can we be sure that will not be infected, and we'll make sure their health? So it's a very different situation in China. In the US, if we don't see an emperor, we see that freedom. That's an opportunity for freedom. In China, a lot of people are so afraid. If there is no emperor, how we can survive? They don't see that as opportunity for freedom. They have a lot of expectations for the government to take care of them, to take responsibilities for them. They see the government not as evil as we see in the West. They see the government as something necessity for their daily life. And the problem now for the government is that they have not taken their responsibilities well. They made mistakes, so they expect the government to correct their mistakes. But in the meantime, they will not think the government should not take care of them. That's the problem. When we saw opening up in some cities, people are even not there to go to the streets because they say, oh, wow, it's so dangerous. It's so ironical in the Chinese situation.
So what do you expect to come from this, if anything, in the coming weeks, months? What do you expect the next few weeks, months to look like?
I think the demonstration is not yet over. And the government is making gradual adjustments, open up some parts of those restrictions, but they still insist that zero COVID policy will continue, and they will continue to try to still keep some of those restrictions. But the problem, I think, for the government is that they have never met an exit strategy. It's either zero COVID or completely opened up. There's no clear transition from the zero COVID to a complete open up. So there are so many chaotic situations in China today. And in that context, I think people are still kind of confused and not happy. But eventually, I think those restrictions would be relaxed sometime next year. And now for not people, not only those inconvenience of their lives and our economy. The economy is suffering by this lockdown and restrictions. So if they opened up and economic activities restored, I think eventually the situation will come back to a new normal, which is that people will be busy at their economic activities, daily life will be restored if there's a larger, if there there is not a larger scale of breakout. I mean the cases, which I don't know if that will happen.
Okay. Well, I must say this is a fascinating degree of context and helpful insight, Professor. So I really appreciate you joining us here for a few minutes of your time and lending us your expertise about this certainly horrible but also fascinating dynamic that's going on in China. Thank you so much, Professor.
You are welcome. My pleasure. Anytime.